In this video, I want to show you all of the steps to go through when you get a new bike, whether it's brand new, as in this case, or a pre-owned bike that's new to you. This video is going to apply to road bikes, gravel bikes, and of course mountain bikes. The only thing different for mountain bikes is the suspension setup. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for the suspension setup. I'll link a video in the description below where I've done that, but I will hit the highlights and at what point in this process you do your suspension setup. Now, I'm sure I won't cover every little tiny thing that you can do on a new bike, but after doing this more times than I can remember, these are all the steps that I go through when I get a new bike in my possession. And by the way, most of the things that I go through in this video can be done with the bike sitting on the ground. So let's get started. The very first thing that I do is I put on the pedals. Just remember, if it's a SRAM crankset, you'll probably have a little washer that goes on the pedals. And also remember, left cranks are a reverse thread and right cranks are a normal thread for the pedals. Next on the list is to set your saddle height. But before you do, you want to put some fiber grip paste on the seat post if it's a carbon frame or if it's an alloy frame and a carbon seat post. If it's an alloy or steel frame with an alloy or steel seat post, then you can use WD-40. And that's the only application I ever use WD-40 on a bike, but it works really well for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to loosen the seat post collar. I'm going to pull the seat post out. I'm going to put some of this paste on, and then I'll set the saddle height. So with the seat post pulled all the way out, I just put a little paste on my fingers and then just kind of spread it around inside. And then I put some on the actual seat post itself. And as you put it back into the bike, you will have some kind of come out of the frame, and you just want to wipe that off. Next, we're going to set our saddle height. Now, I write down all of my saddle height numbers, whether it's a gravel bike or mountain bike. So I know for this bike, it's going to be about 86.5 centimeters. And I measure from the top of the pedal to the middle of the saddle. I'll put in the description below a few different ways that you can set the height of your saddle. My favorite is to use the angle of your knee bend, and I use an app on my phone, and I've got a video on how to do that I'll put below, but I'm gonna go ahead and set this at my normal height. Just a little tip when you do this, you want to tighten the seat post collar just tight enough to where after you get the height of the saddle set, it doesn't move down. And then stand behind the bike and just rotate the saddle back and forth until it lines up perfectly with the top tube. Then tighten the seat post collar. About 6 to 7 Newton meters. You may want to look up the torque specs recommended by your manufacturer. The next thing to do on your new bike is to set the saddle tilt. So that determines whether it's tilted down a little bit, up a little bit, or perfectly flat. I always recommend starting perfectly flat and then adjusting from there. Some people are going to like the saddle tilted down a little bit, some people up. Seat posts have different ways of doing it. The most common are these 2-bolt designs, which are very easy to use. So in this case, if I wanted to tilt the saddle up a little bit, what I would do is I would loosen the front bolt maybe 1 or 2 turns and then tighten the back bolt the same number of turns and then adjust from there. The next adjustment that you want to make is the height of your handlebars. And that's done by adding or removing spacers below the stem. In this case, I want the bars to be a little bit lower. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the top cap, loosen the stem bolts, and then I'm going to remove the stem and then just move 2 spacers from below the stem to above the stem, and that is going to drop the handlebars. Now, if you're not sure, you can just start right in the middle. So if you have 4 spacers, for example, just put 2 above and 2 below. And that way you can adjust from there. This is a pretty tall bike. This is a 160 fork, and I'm not that tall. And so I am going to drop these bars down a bit. It's all a matter of personal preference, also depending on the terrain that you ride. So if you are going to be riding really rugged terrain, you want the bars a little bit higher. If you're going to be riding more cross country with a lot of cornering, then you're going to want the bars to be lower. And it also depends on how tall your fork is. If you're new to using these types of stems, what you do when you put it back together is you want to first tighten the top cap to where it's snug. You can hold the front brake, move the bike back and forth, make sure there's no play, but also make sure it's not too tight because the handlebars should move back and forth pretty easily. Then you're going to line up your handlebars with the front wheel, which is a little bit of an art. You just got to kind of eyeball that. Once it's lined up, you want to go back and forth, tighten each stem bolt, maybe half a turn at a time until they're both at about 5 to 6 Newton meters. The next adjustment that you want to make is the tilt of the handlebars. So whether they're rotated forward or backwards, and what you do is just loosen the 4 stem bolts, and then really just put your hands on the bars. And whatever feels the best for you, it's really going to be a matter of personal preference. You'll also see some lines on the outside or inside of your stem, and you want to make sure that you have equal spacing around the stem. And like I said, this is just really a matter of preference. I mean, for a riser bar, you want to kind of get it to where the riser bar feels like there's enough upsweep where it's kind of coming into your hands, but you don't feel like your wrists are down. And this is another adjustment that you may tweak a little bit when you're out on the trail. So I've been riding riser bars for a long time, so I know about where I want them. And then once you get it set, again, make sure it's lined up, equal spacing around the stem, using those lines as a guide, and then tighten your stem bolts, I'd say around 5 Newton meters. Now it's time to set our shift levers and brake levers. And this takes a lot of tweaking. You're going to set it and it's going to feel great in the garage, and then you're going to get out on the trail and you're going to make a few adjustments. And that's why I always recommend carrying an Allen wrench your first couple of rides on a new bike. So I know that I like my brake levers to where I can pretty much do 1 finger braking, and on really rough descents and steep stuff I can do 2. So always set how far it is in or out first before you set the tilt. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my brake lever again so that my finger hits the point that I'm just really so used to riding like this. And then once I get that set, then I'm going to adjust the tilt. I do the right one first, or you can do the left, and then I measure by my finger. So I've got about 1 finger between the grip and the brake lever, and then I'll do the same on the other side. Now here's a tip. When you tighten the brake levers back up and the shifter levers, you want to tighten them just tight enough to where they can't move when you're using them, and that's it. And that way, if you were to crash and these hit the ground, nothing's going to break. They're just going to move on the handlebars. So just snug. And then sometimes I like to err on the side of them being a little bit too loose, and then if they move a little bit while I'm riding, then I'll just tighten it just ever so slightly. So that should be good. Before adjusting the shift levers, I go ahead and adjust the reach of the brakes. And a lot of brakes today will have a little dial. And so you can turn that dial, you kind of turn it counterclockwise to have the brake lever come in some. I like mine to be fairly close, just close enough to where it doesn't hit my finger when I squeeze it. So right about there. And then do the same thing for the other side. Just go by feel and make them the same. After the brake levers are set, then adjust your shifters. And every shifter is going to be a little bit different depending on the brand, depending on the model. This particular axis shifter, I can just loosen this bolt and slide it in or out. And it's just going to be right where you feel the most comfortable, where your thumb can hit it, where you're not having to reach over too far, but you're also not having to move your thumb out towards the outside of the bar to shift. So really, just right where you can put your thumb up and it's going to hit that. And these access pods you can also tilt, so you can loosen this bolt and tilt them, you know, this way or this way. But just get the shifter set up and then do the same thing on the other side for your dropper post. Dropper post is the same concept. You want it to be where your thumb does not have to stretch out too far and hit it. This one is just tilted up too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen this little bolt here and then just rotate it down under the bar more. So I'm not going to really go too far into it, but just set it up to where it feels really natural to get your thumb on the dropper post lever. Of course, if you're riding a gravel bike or road bike, you probably don't have a dropper post, but most mountain bikes do. I'll go ahead and mention that a lot of dropper post levers have 2 sets of threads. So you can see inside here is another set of threads. So I could undo this bolt, move the lever in, and use this set of threads if I wanted the lever really far inward. To me, that would be way too far inside. This is perfect where it's set up now. The next thing that I'll do is I'll put frame saver tape on my bike. This is my favorite. This is called ISC Racers tape. I get this from Amazon. I'll put a link in the description below. Get the clear kind. Now, I do have white actually, so I could use white on this frame because it's white, but I put this stuff on various places. I won't go into too much detail here, but I typically will put it like back here where my heel will rub, because I use some 510 shoes that have wide soles, and I always get heel rub on these frames. If you can put it on your cranks to keep the heels from rubbing, but basically any place like your heel would rub or a cable would rub. Now this bike has really good cable routing that goes internally, there's really not any spot on this bike where the cable is going to rub. I might put some right here around the head tube in case the bars turn, but really not necessary. But foot rub is definitely an issue for me, and so I just put the frame saver tape there. Now this bike has a really good chainstay protector, and so I don't need to do anything there. If it didn't, some of the older bikes have really wimpy little chainstay protectors, and I make my own with an inner tube. I'll put a link in the description below. I'm linking a lot of videos here, I know it, but I used to make my own. But most modern mountain bikes today, I don't need to do that. But yeah, just protect the frame. That is my next step. What I do, by the way, is I'll put my shoe on the pedal and I'll see kind of where the heel is going to rub. So it's going to be right about there. And then also another little tip is after I put this on, I will use a hairdryer and heat it up. And that makes sure that it just does not come off later. And then I like to put a piece under the down tube along the whole thing. Some carbon frames will already have one installed. This one does not. So I'm going to flip the bike over and then just put a long piece underneath the down tube. If you have a brand new bike with a brand new chain, it's going to have a wax coating and you want to get that off, otherwise it just attracts too much dirt. So I just put some rubbing alcohol on a paper towel, spin the pedals backwards, and then get that off. And it'll be so sticky that it'll even stick to your paper towel. And just keep going until the paper towel kind of glides across the chain. And then what I do is I don't lube my chain for about 3 or 4 rides because you're still going to have some of that waxy coating on the chain, and you want most of that to come off before you put any lube on the chain. The next step is just to get the right amount of tire pressure in your tires. But before you do that, you probably want to convert the tires to tubeless if it's a mountain bike or gravel bike, because if it's brand new, it probably has tubes inside. And this is a great time to go ahead and convert them to tubeless. I won't go into this video on how to do that, but I'll link in the description below a video on how to convert your tires to tubeless so you can reap all the benefits, which include a better riding bike and much less flats while you ride. Okay, we're getting near the end of setting up our new bike. The next thing is to set your suspension. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I will link a very detailed video in the description below, but start off by setting your sag numbers. Now, this particular bike tells me what my rear suspension sag should be. So it says for the 150 stroke, which is this bike, the sag should be about 16 to 20 millimeters. So I'm going to start with around 18 millimeters of sag in the rear. By the way, when you set your sag, you always want to do it with the suspension fully unlocked. A lot of rear suspensions, you can start with your body weight. So if you weigh 150 pounds, you can set the shock to 150 psi. Another tip is you probably want to check your sag again after a couple rides, after the seals get broken in, because sometimes the shock can move more freely. They can be a little bit sticky at first. You want to set the rear and front sag separately. So I like to get the rear sag set up first and do the front. Start with about 15 to 20% sag. So this fork has 160 millimeters of travel. And so if I wanted to do 20%, that would be 32 millimeters. So I would set the O-ring so that the air pressure allows for the O-ring to be 32 millimeters up the stanchion tube. That's about all I'll go into for the suspension setup. Again, check in the description below for a very detailed video that I made of how to set up your suspension to include your rebound and compression damping. The last thing that I like to do is throw the bike in a work stand and just go through the shifting, make sure it shifts okay. Now, if you bought the bike brand new from a reputable bike shop, chances are they've already done that. They should have. But I always like to check just to make sure everything shifts good before I get out on the road or on the trail. Again, I'll link a very detailed video on how to adjust your shifting in the description below in case you want to know how to do that. There actually is one more thing you should do on a brand new bicycle before you head out on your first ride, and that is you want to bed in the brake pads and the rotors. I won't go much into this, but basically what you want to do is try to find a slight downhill. Do one brake at a time. You're going to get up to maybe 18, 20 miles an hour. Squeeze the brake pretty hard, but do not come to a full stop. Come to about walking speed. You can actually accelerate this by pouring a little bit of water on the brake pads and the rotor. I typically don't. I do it on a flat surface. I just pedal up to about 18 to 20 miles an hour. You want to repeat it 10 times per brake. So those are most of the steps that I go through when I get a brand new bike. If you want to go ahead and jump to the video that I made on how to set up suspension, click on the tile right here. All the other videos that I mentioned, I will put in the description below. Any questions or comments that you have, drop those below. Thanks for watching.